Hey everybody, it's Bede with Lambda School. We'll be continuing on with Django here, and we're going to use the Django REST framework to set up a RESTful API that we can use to access our model. So we're going to install the framework. We're going to expose the model that we're interested in sharing through the RESTful API, and then we're going to add some routes to see that get done. And then afterwards, we'll give it a test and see how that works. So this will be a multi-part process. And the first thing we're going to begin with is installing the framework. So in order to get the framework installed, the first thing we'll do be in our virtual environment. And then I'm going to use pip-env install and install the Django REST framework. And now that that's installed, we need to go ahead and tell Django to use that. So we'll do that in our settings for our project. So under Django settings, I want to do a couple things. Under installed apps right here, let's add in the settings, let's do this. In our project settings, what we'll want to do is we'll go to our installed apps, and we need to tell it that we're going to be using the REST framework here. So I'm going to add REST framework to the installed apps. And so this way Django is aware of it. And then we also need to add some configuration information about the framework. And so we're going to just add this to the bottom of the file. And I'm going to add this config information for the default permission classes. And in here, we want to use the permissions that the model sets or give read-only access to anonymous users if people are not logged in. So we do this like this, REST framework.permissions.django model permissions. This gets a little bit long, so we're going to use the model permissions, or if we're an anonymous user, we're going to get read-only permission. So we've added this block of code here. So REST framework, default permission classes, and this is telling us what we want to use for permission by default when we use the REST framework to access this information. So REST underscore framework dot permissions dot Django model permissions or anon read only. So we're going to use the model permissions or read only permission for anonymous users. So we have that stuff set up in the settings file. So that's kind of our initial boilerplate. Now what we want to do is we need to somehow tell Django that, hey, we want to set up a RESTful API that uses a particular model, that exposes a particular model to share through a particular endpoint. So step one, getting the install and the settings configured. Step two is going to be exposing the model. And we're going to do that here in our notes. We're going to add a new file called api.py, and this is where we'll put our RESTful API stuff that connects the model to the REST framework. And we're going to do this in kind of two steps. The first step is going to be determining which data we wish to export through the API, and then, or which fields, I should say, we're going to export through the API, which fields out of our note. So in the note, we have a bunch of stuff, and we're going to export some of these fields. Let's say title and content we'll export. So we'll define the fields that we want to export, and then in another piece of code, we'll define the rows that we want to export. And that's going to be kind of different depending on the user that's logged in. That's something we'll tackle later. But for now, we'll just say, let's return all the rows. And so step one, let's define the fields that we want to export. And so we need to pull in something called a serializer. I'm going to bring in serializers from REST framework. And I also need the personal note class from our models. So from .models import personal note. So I'll bring that in there as well. And then we're going to make a thing called a serializer that helps determine which fields we want to expose. So I'm going to make something called a personal note serializer. And this is going to inherit from this thing called hyperlinked model serializer. And what this will do, we'll see later, will give us some nice hyperlinks when we go in to view the API through a web browser. So in here, we're going to do a couple things. We need to register the model that we're interested in, and we need to register the fields within that model we're interested in. And we're going to do that using an inner class called meta. So I'm going to declare a nested class within the personal note serializer, and it's going to have metadata that we want to expose here. So the first thing we're going to do is attach it to the personal note model. So it knows which model, and then we have to tell it which fields out of that model we want to export. And I was thinking here that we would do title and content out of our note fields. So let's put those in here, title and content. So those are the fields that we want to show. So the serializer gets us that, but we also need to show the rows. Which rows out of all the data we have in the database do we want to show? And we're going to use something called a view set to do that. So I'm going to pull that in here, view sets. And then we're going to make another class that subclasses the view set and shows the information. So we're going to make something called the personal note view set. And that's going to inherit from view sets dot model view set. And again, this is going to tell us which rows we're interested in showing. We need to attach this to the serializer we just made. So we'll do that right now by saying the serializer class is personal note serializer. So this line will connect this class back up to this class, and this class is connected to our note model through its meta inner class. So we're kind of building a line of data flow through here. And then we need to tell it which things we need to return. We want to return. We're going to say a query set. This is what's going to be the return data from here. Is going to be personal note. We're going to get all the objects out of this. So objects.all. We're going to retrieve everything. So that's the result of our query set. At this point, now that this is saved, might be a good idea to do a quick run server just to make sure that everything seems happy so far. We haven't put in a new endpoint yet for this, but we'll do that shortly, and then we'll be able to actually connect to it. All right, so now that we've tested the servers running, the last thing we want to do is add some routes so we can try this thing out. And so to add some new routes to our API, we're going to use something called routers from the REST framework. We're going to add that into our urls.py file here in our project. So having a look here, we see that there's the admin path here, but we can add more paths to do our RESTful API stuff. And the REST framework helps with a lot of this. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring in from REST framework, bring in routers. And then I'm going to bring in the personal note view set that we have declared over here in our API. So remember, the personal note view set is connected up to our serializer, which is connected up to our note. So I'm going to bring in the personal note view set from Notes API and bring that in here as well. And next we need to hook this up to the router. Some of this is going to seem a little magical because the REST framework is doing a lot of the work for us. So I'm going to make a new router here, and then I'm going to register the endpoint name. This is going to be in the actual URL with the view set. So we made a router, we've registered this notes endpoint in there. What we're going to do is we're going to have a variety of endpoints here, or we can have a variety of endpoints here, and we're going to put them all underneath the API path. So I'm going to have localhost port 8000/API/notes. And we can put that together in one line here using include that we get from Django URLs. So this include function we'll make use of right here. Adding that from Django URLs, and then I'm going to add a path down here for the API, and we can use include router.urls to make this happen. So we've registered notes with our router, and then we're passing that in here to path. So now what we'll end up with is an endpoint that says that is API/notes. And that's how we'll get into our notes API. So let's save this file, and let's go back here and start up the server. And now that we have the server started, let's actually run over to our notes API and see what happens. API/notes. Let's have a look. Hey, look at this. We haven't actually added any code to the front end at all, but built in to the API, when we view it in a browser here with debug set, we get some information here. It says, hey, we just did a GET request on API/notes, which we did. And we see that we've got a title note, let's see, and content. So it's giving us information from the personal notes we have here. And remember that this is because we have done personal notes here in the API. So we have our personal note serializer and personal note view set and so on. So that's what's showing up here is the personal notes. We have a form down here even where we could post a new personal note. So let's go ahead and post something and see what happens. We get this error, integrity error at API notes, whatever this is all about. Not null, constraint failed, notes personal note dot user ID. And what's ringing a bell here is that, hey, we have a user associated with each personal note, but we haven't done anything here to actually put that user in place. That is, we just try to create a note with title and content, but we need to specify user as well. And we don't have a way to do that from this post field yet. But that will be a task for the future. For now, we have set up successfully an endpoint that we can go to get our notes. So, for a challenge, let's go through and expose another model through a different endpoint than we covered in this example. Some of the boilerplate stuff you had to do up front to install the REST framework and all that stuff, you don't have to do that again, but you will have to set up another view set and all that to make it happen. As always, thanks for watching.